Historically, white colonizers who raped Indian women claimed that the real rapists were Indian men. Today, white men who rape and murder Indian women often make the same claim. In the late 1980s, a white man, Jesse Coulter, raped, murdered, and mutilated several Indian women in Minneapolis. He claimed to be Indian, adopting the name Jesse Sitting Crow and emblazing an aim tattoo on his arm. Roy Martin, a full-blooded Native man, was charged with sexual assault in Bemidji, Minnesota. The survivor identified the rapist as white, around 25 years old, with a shag haircut. Martin was 35, with hair past his shoulders. In a search of major newspaper coverage of sexual assaults in Native communities from 1998 to 2004, I found coverage almost entirely limited to cases where a Native man, or a white man who purports to be Native, was the suspected perpetrator and the victim was a white woman. There was virtually no coverage of Native women as victims of sexual assault. This absence is even more startling when one considers that Native women are more likely than other groups of women in the U.S. to be sexual assault victims. Similarly, after the Civil War, black men in the U.S. were targeted for lynching for their supposed mass rapes of white women. The racist belief was that white women need to be protected from predatory black men, when, in fact, black women needed protection from white men. In her investigations of lynches that occurred between 1865 and 1895, anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Wells calculated that more than 10,000 black people had been lynched. During that same period, not one white person was lynched for raping or killing a black person. In addition, while the ostensible reason for these lynches was to protect white women from black rapists, Wells discovered that only a third of those lynched had even been accused of rape, and most of the black men accused of rape had been involved in obviously consensual sexual relationships with white women. Of course, Indian men do commit acts of sexual violence. After years of colonialism and boarding school experience, violence has been internalized within Indian communities. However, this view of the Indian man as the true rapist serves to obscure who has the real power in this racist and patriarchal society. Thus, the colonization of Native women, as well as other women of color, is part of the project of strengthening white male ownership of white women. And while the era of Indian massacres in their more explicit form has ended in North America, the wholesale rape and mutilation of indigenous women's bodies continues. During the 1982 massacre of Mayan people in the Aldea Rio Negro, Guatemala, 177 women and children were killed. The young women were raped in front of their mothers, and the mothers were killed in the front of their children. The younger children were then tied at the ankles and dashed across the rocks until their skulls were broken. This massacre, committed by the Guatemalan army, was funded by the U.S. government. In a 1997 massacre in Chiapas, Mexico, indigenous women were targeted paramilitary forces for sexual mutilation, gang rape, and torture. Amnesty International reports that torture against indigenous peoples in Latin America is routine, including electric shocks, semi-asphyxiation with plastic bags or by submersion underwater, death threats, mock executions, beatings using sharp objects, sticks, or rifle butts, rape, and sexual abuse. One wonders why the mass rapes in Guatemala, Chiapas, or elsewhere against indigenous people in Latin America does not spark the same outrage as the rapes in Bosnia in the 1990s. In fact, feminist legal scholar Catherine McKinnon argues that in Bosnia, quote, the world has never seen sex used this consciously, this cynically, this elaborately, this openly, this systemically, as a means of destroying a whole people, end quote. Here McKinnon seems to have forgotten that she lives on this land because millions of Native peoples were raped, sexually mutilated, and murdered. Is mass rape against European women genocide, while mass rape against indigenous women is business as usual? The historical context of rape, racism, and colonialism continues to impact women in North America as well. This legacy is most evident in the rate of violence that in American Indian communities. American Indian women are twice as likely to be victimized by violent crime as women or men of any other group. In addition, 60% of the perpetrators of violence against American Indian women are white. In times of crisis, sexual violence against Native women escalates. When I served as a nonviolent witness for the Chippewa spearfishers who were being harassed by white racist mobs in the 1980s, one white harasser carried a sign that read, quote, "Save a fish, spear a pregnant squaw," end quote. During the 1990 Mohawk crisis in Quebec, Canada, a white mob surrounded an ambulance carrying a Native woman who was attempting to leave the Mohawk reservation because she was hemorrhaging after giving birth. She was forced to spread her legs to prove she had delivered a baby. The police at the scene refused to intervene. An Indian man was arrested for wearing a disguise, he was wearing jeans, and was brutally beaten at the scene with his testicles crushed. 2 women from Chicago Women of All Red Nations, WARN, went to Oka to videotape the crisis. They were arrested and held in custody for 11 hours without being charged, and were told that they could not go to the bathroom unless the male police officers could watch. The place they were held was covered with pornographic magazines. This colonial desire to subjugate Indian women's bodies was quite apparent when, in 1982, Stuart Caston marked Custer's Revenge, a video game in which players get points every time they, in the form of Custer, raped an Indian woman. The slogan of the game is, quote, "When you score, end quote. He describes the game as, quote, "a fun sequence where the woman is enjoying a sexual act willingly," end quote. According to the promotional material, quote, "You are General Custer. Your dander's up, your pister's wavin'. You've hog-tied a ravishing Indian maiden and have a chance to rewrite history and even up an old score. Now, the Indian maiden's hands might be tied, but she's not about to take it lying down, by George. Help is on the way. If you're to get revenge, you have to rise to the challenge, draw a tribe of flying arrows, and protect your flanks against some downright mean and prickly cactus. But if you can stand pat and last pass the strings and arrows, you can stand last. Remember, revenge is sweet," end quote. Sexual violence as a tool of racism also continues against other women of color. Trafficking in women from Asian and other global South countries continues unabated in the U.S. According to the Central Intelligence Agency, 45,000 to 50,000 women are trafficked in the U.S. each year. In addition, there are over 50,000 Filipina mail-order brides in the U.S. alone. White men, desiring women they presume to be submissive, procure mail-order brides who, because of their precarious legal status, are vulnerable to domestic and sexual violence. As the promotional material for mail-order brides describes them, Filipinas have, quote, "exceptionally smooth skin and tight vaginas. They are low-maintenance wives. They can always be returned and replaced by a younger model," end quote. Women of color are also targeted for sexual violence crossing the U.S. border. Blacks and Latinos comprise 43% of those searched through customs, even though they comprise 24% of the population. The American Friends Service Committee documented over 346 reports of gender violence on the U.S.-Mexico border from 1993 to 95. And this is just the report of one agency, which does not account for the women who either do not report or report to another agency. This one case is emblematic of the kinds of abuse women face at the border. A Border Patrol agent, Larry Selders, raped several women over a period of time. Finally, one of the rape victims in Nogales, Arizona, had to sue the United States government for not taking action to investigate her rape. Selders demanded sex from the woman in return for her release. When she refused, Selders drove her out of town to an isolated area, raped her, and threatened her not to say anything to anyone. Her defense describes in great detail the horrible trauma that she continues to suffer after the incident. Although the rape took place in 1993, it was only in October 1999 that the court finally arrived at a decision in favor of the victims. Quote, "The government guarded information about Selders' prior acts. It took more than 3 years of legal battles to uncover that at least 3 other victims were known to the government," quote, end quote, declared the victim's attorney, Jesus Romo. Sexual violence and impunity. The ideology of Native women's bodies as rapeable is evident in the hundreds of missing Indigenous women in Mexico and Canada. Since 1993, over 500 women have been murdered in Juarez, Mexico. The majority have been sexually mutilated, raped, and tortured, including having had their nipples cut off. Poor and Indigenous women have been particularly targeted. Not only have the local police made no effort to solve the cases, they appear to be complicit in the murders. Amnesty International and other human rights organizations and activists have noted their failure to seriously investigate the cases. The police have made several arrests and tortured those arrested to extract confessions, but the murders have continued unabated. Furthermore, the general response of the police to these murders is to blame the victims by arguing that they are sex workers or lesbians, and hence inherently rapeable. For instance, one former state public prosecutor commented in 1999, quote, "It's hard to go out in the street when it's raining and not get wet," end quote. Similarly, in Canada, over 500 First Nations women have gone missing or been murdered in the past 15 years, with little police investigation. Again, it seems that their cases have been neglected because many of the women were homeless or sex workers. Ida Elaine Brown, the sister of Terry Brown, president of the Native Women's Association of Canada, was found dead in her bed in 2002. She was so badly beaten her family did not recognize her. According to Terry Brown, quote, "The autopsy report said it was a brain aneurysm. Yeah, because she was beaten to a pulp," end quote. Last section is coming next.